The noon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a small settlement that had sprung up alongside the new railroad cutting through the Arizona Territory. The town's wooden structures baked in the heat, their weathered planks groaning under the relentless assault of sun and wind. Most folks had the good sense to remain indoors during these scorching hours, but not Caleb Blackwood. The outlaw stood motionless outside the saloon, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the dirt road. His weathered face, framed by a dark beard streaked with gray, revealed little of what churned beneath the surface. At 45, Caleb had lived longer than most men of his profession, surviving through a combination of ruthlessness, cunning, and an unmatched skill with his Colt revolver. The weapon hung low on his right hip, the holster worn smooth from years of quick draws that had left 7 men dead and countless others nursing wounds and bruised pride. Would you kindly subscribe to our channel? We'd love to know what city you're watching from. Redemption Creek was not Caleb's usual haunt. He preferred to remain in constant motion, never lingering long enough in one place for the law to catch his scent. But circumstances had conspired to bring him here. A promise made to a dying friend to deliver a letter and a small leather pouch to a woman named Elizabeth Morgan. The task should have been simple. Ride in, make the delivery, and vanish before anyone recognized his face from the tattered wanted posters that hung in sheriff's offices across 3 territories. Yet something about this dusty little town had caused him to linger for 3 days now, and that something had just emerged from the general store across the street. Elizabeth Morgan, the town's schoolteacher, walked with purpose, her chin held high despite the whispers that followed her. Caleb watched her progress, noting the way the townspeople both respected and distrusted her. She was an outsider here, just as he was, though for entirely different reasons. She had come from Boston 6 months ago, bringing with her ideas and books and a determination to bring education to the frontier. Her auburn hair was pulled back neatly, and her blue dress, though simple, carried an elegance that seemed out of place in this rough-hewn town. Sheriff James Harker stepped out of his office just as Elizabeth passed by. His tall frame and broad shoulders cast a long shadow, and the silver star on his chest caught the sunlight. "Miss Morgan," he called out, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Another fine day for molding young minds." There was something in his tone that made Caleb's hand instinctively drift toward his gun. The sheriff's smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and calculating. Elizabeth nodded politely, but kept walking, her pace quickening slightly. Caleb had seen enough of frontier towns to recognize the dynamics at play. The sheriff held power here, and he wasn't accustomed to being denied what he wanted. And it was increasingly clear to Caleb that what Harker wanted was Elizabeth Morgan, willing or not. The realization stirred something in Caleb he hadn't felt in years, a protective instinct he'd long thought dead and buried alongside the man he'd once been. Caleb had delivered the letter and pouch 2 days ago, fulfilling his promise to his friend Marcus, who had died in his arms after a bank robbery gone wrong in Tucson. The delivery should have been the end of it, yet here he remained, nursing whiskey at the saloon and observing the town's rhythms. He told himself he was waiting for the heat to die down after a stage robbery 2 counties over that had been falsely attributed to him. But the truth was more complicated. The letter he delivered had caused Elizabeth visible distress. She had read it in his presence, her face growing pale, and then asked him questions about Marcus that Caleb had been reluctant to answer. How could he tell this refined woman that her brother had died an outlaw's death after a life spent on the wrong side of the law? Yet something in her eyes, a determination, a strength that belied her gentle appearance, had compelled him to tell her the truth, or at least most of it. Night fell over Redemption Creek, bringing with it a coolness that allowed the town to exhale after the punishing heat of the day. Caleb sat alone at a corner table in the Frontier Saloon, nursing a glass of whiskey and keeping his back to the wall, a habit that had saved his life more than once. The saloon's usual cacophony washed over him, the tinny piano playing a jaunty tune, the raucous laughter of cowboys fresh off the trail, the soft murmurs of card players engaged in serious games of poker. Through the haze of tobacco smoke, Caleb observed the room's occupants, categorizing each as threat or non-threat with the practiced eye of a predator. His attention was drawn to a table near the center of the room, where Sheriff Harker sat with 3 other men, all wearing expensive suits that marked them as business types rather than cowboys or miners. They spoke in low tones, their conversation punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter that carried an undercurrent of cruelty. The bat-wing doors of the saloon swung open, and a hush fell over the room as Elizabeth Morgan stepped inside. It was unusual for a woman of her standing to enter such an establishment, especially unescorted and after dark. She stood in the entrance for a moment, scanning the room until her gaze settled on Caleb. With determined steps, she crossed the floor, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed her. "Mr. Blackwood," she said as she reached his table, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "I need to speak with you." Caleb gestured to the empty chair across from him, his expression revealing nothing of his surprise. Elizabeth sat down, her posture rigid, her eyes darting nervously around the room before settling back on him. "I've received information," she said in a hushed tone, leaning forward, "that suggests my brother's death was not an accident, as you led me to believe." Her eyes, the color of stormy skies, held his with an intensity that few men had dared to direct at Caleb Blackwood. Caleb took a slow sip of his whiskey, buying time as he considered his response. He had indeed withheld certain details about Marcus's death, specifically that Sheriff Harker had been present at the bank robbery, not as a lawman, but as a participant who had double-crossed his accomplices when the shooting started. "Your brother was betrayed," Caleb finally said, his voice a low rumble that carried no further than their table, "by a man who now wears a badge in this town." Elizabeth's sharp intake of breath told him she had suspected as much. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table to him. "This was hidden in the pouch you delivered," she explained. "It's a deed to a gold mine in the hills north of here. My brother wrote that it's worth a fortune, and that certain men would kill to possess it." Her fingers lingered on the paper, trembling slightly. "Men like Sheriff Harker and his associates." The revelation shifted something in Caleb's understanding of the situation. Marcus hadn't simply been another outlaw. He had stumbled upon something valuable enough to die for, something that had drawn the attention of powerful men. Caleb's eyes flicked toward the sheriff's table, noting the intense interest with which Harker was watching their conversation. "You're in danger," Caleb stated matter-of-factly, returning his gaze to Elizabeth. She nodded, a sad smile touching her lips. "I've suspected as much since strange men began watching the schoolhouse. Yesterday, my home was searched while I was teaching." Her voice dropped even lower. "Last night, a man tried to break into my quarters behind the school. I barricaded the door, and he eventually left, but..." Her voice trailed off. the unspoken threat hanging in the air between them. Caleb felt a familiar cold anger settling in his gut, the kind that had preceded violence throughout his life. "Leave town," he advised, his tone flat and unemotional. "Take the deed and go somewhere they can't find you." Elizabeth shook her head, determination flashing in her eyes. "This is my home now. My students need me." She leaned closer, her voice urgent. "Besides, I have nowhere to go. I've spent every penny I had to come here and establish the school." Caleb's jaw tightened. Her stubbornness reminded him of Marcus, who had also refused to run from trouble, preferring to face it head-on, usually with guns blazing. That approach had gotten him killed. "Then sell the deed," Caleb suggested. "Use the money to start over somewhere else." Again, Elizabeth shook her head. "The mine isn't just valuable for its gold," she explained. "According to my brother's letter, it contains evidence of Harker's crimes, ledgers, correspondence, proof that he's been working with the railroad to force people off their land through intimidation and murder." At the bar, a commotion erupted as two cowboys argued over a spilled drink. Caleb used the distraction to scan the room again, noting that two of the men from Harker's table had positioned themselves near the exits. They were planning something, and Caleb had a strong suspicion it involved the woman sitting across from him. "Listen carefully," he said, fixing Elizabeth with an intense stare. "When I create a diversion, go out through the kitchen. There's an alley that leads behind the general store. Wait for me there." Elizabeth's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you going to do?" Caleb's hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol. "What I do best," he replied grimly. Elizabeth's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "No," she whispered urgently, "no killing. There's been enough death already." Her hand reached across the table, her fingers lightly touching his arm, a contact that sent an unexpected jolt through Caleb's hardened defenses. The moment was shattered as Sheriff Harker approached their table, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor. "Miss Morgan," he drawled, his smile cold and predatory. "This isn't a suitable establishment for a lady of your standing." His gaze shifted to Caleb, the smile vanishing. "And you, stranger, I've been asking around about you. Seems you match the description of a wanted man." Caleb remained impassive, his hand still resting near his gun. "Is that so?" he replied evenly. Harker's hand hovered near his own pistol. "I think you'd better come along to my office. We have some questions that need answering." The sheriff's two companions had moved closer, their hands similarly positioned near their weapons. The tension in the saloon was palpable now, the other patrons slowly backing away from what they recognized as an imminent confrontation. Elizabeth stood suddenly, placing herself between Caleb and the sheriff. "He's my guest in town, Sheriff Harker, a friend of my late brother." Harker's expression darkened. "Your brother was a thief and a murderer, Miss Morgan. If this man was his friend, that tells me all I need to know." His hand moved to his gun, but before he could draw, Caleb upended the heavy oak table, sending it crashing into Harker and one of his men. In the same fluid motion, Caleb pulled Elizabeth down behind the makeshift barrier as shots rang out from the sheriff's second companion. Screams filled the saloon as patrons scrambled for the exits. "Kitchen!" Caleb shouted to Elizabeth over the chaos. "Go now!" She hesitated for just a moment, her eyes locked with his, before scrambling away in a rustle of skirts. Caleb drew his Colt and fired a precise shot that sent the second gunman diving for cover. He had no desire to kill, not because of Elizabeth's plea, he told himself, but because dead lawmen brought the kind of attention he couldn't afford. legitimate badge or not. Sheriff Harker had regained his footing and was shouting orders to his men as Caleb made his own exit, firing 2 more shots to keep their heads down. The night air hit him as he burst from the saloon's back door, scanning the dark alley for signs of danger or pursuit. A soft whisper from the shadows drew his attention. "Mr. Blackwood." Elizabeth emerged from behind a stack of crates, her face pale in the moonlight. Without speaking, Caleb took her arm and led her swiftly through the maze of alleys behind the main street, his senses alert for any sound of pursuit. They reached the livery stable without incident, and Caleb quickly saddled his black stallion, while Elizabeth watched nervously from the doorway. "We need to leave town," he said, his tone brooking no argument as he tightened the cinch. "Harker won't stop now. He knows you have the deed, and he'll kill to get it." Elizabeth's shoulders sagged slightly, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. "All I wanted was to teach children to read," she said softly, more to herself than to Caleb. Something twisted in Caleb's chest at the defeat in her voice. This woman had traveled across a continent to build something meaningful, only to have it threatened by men like Harker, men like Caleb himself had once been. "The mine," he said abruptly. "How far?" Elizabeth looked up, surprise evident on her face. "About 15 miles north, in the foothills." "Why?" Caleb led his horse out of the stall. "If the evidence against Harker is there, we need to secure it. It's your only leverage." Understanding dawned in Elizabeth's eyes, followed quickly by determination. "There's a small cabin at the mine entrance," she said. "My brother's letter mentioned it." Caleb nodded and helped her mount the horse before swinging up behind her. As they rode out of Redemption Creek under the cover of darkness, Caleb Blackwood found himself breaking a vow he had made 5 years earlier after a job gone wrong in Colorado. Never again would he risk his life for another person. Yet here he was, riding into danger with a schoolteacher pressed against him, her trust a burden heavier than any he had carried before. Dawn broke over the Arizona wilderness, painting the rocky landscape in hues of gold and crimson. Caleb and Elizabeth had ridden through the night, following game trails and dry creek beds to avoid the main roads where Harker's men might be watching. They had spoken little during the journey, each lost in their own thoughts as the rhythmic hoofbeats of Caleb's stallion carried them deeper into the foothills. Caleb's body was tense with the vigilance of a man accustomed to being hunted, while Elizabeth's occasional shivers betrayed her exhaustion and fear. Now, as they crested a ridge overlooking a small valley, Caleb reined in the horse and surveyed their surroundings. Below them, nestled against the base of a cliff face, stood a crude cabin with a mine entrance visible nearby. "Is that it?" he asked, his breath warm against Elizabeth's ear. She nodded, pointing to a narrow trail that wound down from their position. "According to the map in my brother's letter, that's the Lucky Strike mine." The cabin was in better condition than Caleb had expected, its walls of stacked stone still solid, despite the wooden roof having partially collapsed in one corner. Inside, a thick layer of dust covered the sparse furnishings: a small table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. Elizabeth moved immediately to a loose floorboard near the stove, kneeling to pry it up with fingers made clumsy by fatigue. "Marcus wrote that he hid important documents here," she explained as she reached into the revealed cavity. Her face fell as her hand emerged empty. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice thick with disappointment. Caleb knelt beside her, his own hand reaching into the hiding place. His fingers brushed against something metal, pushed far back against the wall, a small tin box that had been overlooked. He withdrew it and handed it to Elizabeth, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside the box lay a folded sheet of paper and a small leather-bound journal. Elizabeth quickly scanned the paper, her eyes widening. "It's a letter from my brother to me," she said, her voice catching. "He says the main documents were moved to—" she faltered, looking up at Caleb with renewed hope. "To a hidden compartment in the mine shaft itself. He was worried the cabin might be searched." Caleb nodded grimly. It was a smart precaution, and one that had likely paid off, given the empty hiding place beneath the floorboard. "The journal?" he inquired, gesturing toward the small book she still held. Elizabeth opened it and began reading, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she turned the pages. "It's my brother's account of how he discovered the mine and what happened afterward," she explained, looking up with shock evident in her eyes. "Sheriff Harker wasn't just involved in robberies. According to this, he's been working with a man named Cornelius Whitmore, a railroad representative, to drive settlers off their land along the proposed rail line." The name struck a chord in Caleb's memory. Whitmore, he mused. Tall man, expensive suits, has a habit of tapping his cane when he's thinking. Elizabeth nodded, surprised. "You know him?" Caleb's expression darkened. "We've crossed paths. He hired guns to clear Mexican farmers from land near the border 2 years back. Offered me a job, which I declined." What Caleb didn't add was that he had declined by putting a bullet through Whitmore's hat as a warning to leave him alone, a warning that had been heeded. According to Marcus, Elizabeth continued, her finger tracing lines in the journal, Whitmore and Harker have been partners for years, using the law as cover for land grabs and extortion. When Marcus discovered gold here, he kept it quiet, but somehow they found out. That's when the threats started. She looked up at Caleb, her eyes reflecting a mix of grief and anger. "They killed my brother for this mine, didn't they?" Caleb couldn't bring himself to soften the truth. "Yes," he said simply. Elizabeth's jaw tightened, a steely resolve replacing her earlier uncertainty. "Then we need to find those documents and expose them," she declared, standing and brushing the dust from her skirt. "The mine entrance is just outside." Caleb caught her arm as she moved toward the door. "Wait," he cautioned. "If they search the cabin, they might have searched the mine too. Or worse, they could be watching it now." He moved to the cabin's single window, carefully scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of movement or the telltale glint of a rifle barrel in the morning sun. The landscape appeared deserted, but Caleb had survived this long by assuming danger lurked behind every rock and tree. "I'll check the mine," he decided. "You stay here, out of sight." Elizabeth shook her head firmly. "I'm coming with you." The journal mentions specific markers that indicate where the documents are hidden. "You need me." The mine entrance was a dark wound in the cliff face, reinforced with timber supports that groaned softly in the morning breeze. Caleb approached cautiously, his Colt drawn and his senses alert for any sign of an ambush. Elizabeth followed close behind, the journal clutched in her hands. The air growing cooler as they entered the tunnel, darkness enveloping them as they moved away from the entrance. Caleb struck a match, the sudden flare of light revealing a well-constructed shaft that extended deeper into the mountain. "There should be lanterns," Elizabeth said, pointing to a shelf near the entrance where several oil lamps sat. Caleb lit one, adjusting the wick to provide maximum illumination without excessive smoke. The yellow glow revealed a mine that had seen significant work. A track for ore carts ran down the center of the tunnel. Support beams were placed at regular intervals, and various tools hung from hooks along the walls. They moved deeper into the mine, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Elizabeth consulted the journal frequently, comparing landmarks mentioned by her brother to their surroundings. Marcus writes that he found a natural chamber about 200 yards in, she explained, her voice hushed, as if afraid of being overheard despite the apparent solitude of the mine. He used it as his office of sorts, keeping maps and documents there. The tunnel began to slope downward, the air growing damper and the walls glistening with moisture. After several minutes of careful progress, they reached a fork in the tunnel. Elizabeth studied the journal again, then pointed to the right passage. "This way," she said confidently. "He mentions a cart with a broken wheel at the junction, and there it is." She indicated a rusty ore cart tilted to one side, its wooden wheels splintered and partially collapsed. The right tunnel was narrower, the ceiling lower, forcing Caleb to duck his head in places. After another 50 yards, the passage opened suddenly into a natural cavern about 20 feet across, its ceiling lost in shadows above the reach of their lamplight. A crude desk, fashioned from wooden planks and empty crates, stood against one wall, its surface covered with maps and papers, held down by rock samples. Elizabeth rushed forward excitedly, rifling through the documents, while Caleb remained near the entrance, his attention divided between watching her and monitoring the tunnel behind them. "These are survey maps," Elizabeth said, disappointment evident in her voice. "Nothing about Harker or the railroad." She continued searching, moving papers aside and examining each item carefully. "Wait," she said suddenly, her hands stilling on what appeared to be an ordinary rock sample. Marcus mentions this in his journal. She picked up the rock, a piece of quartz streaked with gold veins, and turned it over in her hands, examining it closely before pressing on a particular spot. To Caleb's surprise, the bottom of the rock slid open, revealing a hollow interior. From this hiding place, Elizabeth extracted a folded packet of papers sealed with wax. "This is it," she breathed, breaking the seal and carefully unfolding the documents. Her eyes widened as she scanned the contents. Letters between Whitmore and Harker, receipts for payments to hired guns, a list of properties seized and their owners who mysteriously disappeared or were found dead. She looked up at Caleb, her face pale in the lamplight. "It's all here, evidence of years of corruption and murder, enough to hang them both." The sound was subtle, a small displacement of air, the faintest scrape of boot leather against stone. But it was enough to alert Caleb's honed senses. "Get down!" he shouted, lunging toward Elizabeth as a shot rang out, a bullet splintering the desk where she had been standing moments before. Caleb's momentum carried them both to the ground behind the desk, his body covering hers protectively as more shots peppered their makeshift shelter. "Well now, isn't this cozy?" came Sheriff Harker's mocking voice from the tunnel entrance. "The schoolmarm and the outlaw, all cuddled up together." Caleb cursed silently. He had been so focused on Elizabeth and the documents that he had allowed himself to be outflanked. A rookie mistake that could cost them both their lives. "Hand over those papers, Miss Morgan," Harker continued, his tone hardening, "and maybe I'll let you walk out of here alive. Your companion, however, has an appointment with a hanging tree." Elizabeth's breath came in short, frightened gasps, but her eyes remained determined as she clutched the documents to her chest. "There's another way out," she whispered to Caleb, her lips so close to his ear that her words were felt rather than heard. Marcus mentioned a natural chimney at the back of the cavern that leads to the surface. Caleb nodded almost imperceptibly, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the desk. "When I start shooting, make for the back wall," he murmured. "I'll be right behind you." Without waiting for her response, he rolled to the edge of the desk and fired 3 rapid shots toward the tunnel entrance, forcing Harker and whoever was with him to take cover. Elizabeth scrambled to her feet, gathering her skirts and dashing toward the rear of the cavern as Caleb continued firing. The muzzle flashes of his Colt briefly illuminating the stone chamber in stark relief. The return fire was immediate and heavy, at least 3 guns by Caleb's count. He emptied his revolver, then retreated in a crouching run toward where Elizabeth stood beside a narrow vertical shaft that disappeared into darkness above them. "It's too steep to climb," she said desperately as he reached her. Caleb holstered his empty gun and drew a knife from his boot. He quickly cut a strip from the bottom of Elizabeth's petticoat, ignoring her startled gasp. "Wrap the papers in this and put them inside your bodice," he instructed as he reloaded his Colt with practiced efficiency. "If something happens to me, you get those to the U.S. Marshal in Tucson." Elizabeth complied, her fingers working quickly to secure the documents. "Nothing's gonna happen to you," she insisted, her voice stronger than he expected, given their dire circumstances. "We're getting out of here together." Caleb allowed himself a brief, genuine smile, the first Elizabeth had seen from him. "I admire your optimism, schoolteacher," he said, peering up the natural chimney that rose above them. The shaft was narrow but navigable, with enough irregularities in its surface to serve as handholds. "Ladies first," he said, interlacing his fingers to create a stirrup for her foot. With his help, Elizabeth began to climb, her progress slow but steady as she found purchase on the rough stone walls. Caleb fired several more shots toward the tunnel entrance, where shadows indicated Harker's men were preparing to rush their position, then holstered his gun and began his own ascent. The climb was arduous, the stones slick in places with mineral seepage, but the sound of pursuit from below lent speed to their efforts. Elizabeth reached a point where the chimney narrowed significantly, her progress halting as she struggled to find a way through. "I'm stuck," she called down softly, panic edging into her voice. Caleb had nearly reached her position, his larger frame making the climb even more challenging. "Push upward with your back against one wall and your feet against the other," he advised, remembering a similar predicament during a bank job in Kansas years earlier. Elizabeth followed his instructions, her face contorted with effort as she inched her way through the constriction. Suddenly, her expression changed. "I feel a breeze," she exclaimed, "and I can see light." With renewed determination, she pushed onward, disappearing from Caleb's view as she emerged into what must be the surface opening of the chimney. Caleb followed, his muscles burning from the exertion, aware that sounds of pursuit had grown louder below. The shaft opened onto a narrow ledge partway up the cliff face, providing a dizzying view of the valley below. Elizabeth helped pull Caleb through the final few feet, both of them collapsing onto the ledge, breathing heavily from their exertions. The respite was brief. A bullet ricocheted off the cliff face inches from Caleb's head, sending stone fragments flying. Harker and his men had emerged from the mine entrance and spotted them on the ledge. "We need to move," Caleb urged, scanning their surroundings. A game trail led from the ledge around the curve of the cliff, offering their only escape route. They followed it, staying low and using the irregular terrain for cover as bullets continued to strike around them. The trail climbed steadily, zigzagging up the cliff face until they reached the top of the ridge, momentarily out of sight of their pursuers. Caleb pulled Elizabeth down behind a large boulder, both of them gasping for breath in the thin mountain air. "They'll be coming up the trail," he said grimly, checking his ammunition. He had 5 bullets remaining, not enough to hold off Harker and his men for long. Elizabeth peered around the boulder toward the cabin and mine entrance below. "There are 4 of them," she reported, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "Harker, the 2 men from the saloon, and another I don't recognize." Caleb joined her, confirming her count and recognizing the 4th man as one of Whitmore's hired guns, a particularly vicious killer known only as Reynolds. "They're splitting up," he observed. 2 coming up the trail, 2 circling around to cut off our escape." He turned to Elizabeth, his expression grave. "We're trapped unless we can reach my horse." The stallion was where they had left him, tethered in a small copse of juniper trees about 50 yards from their current position. To reach him, they would need to cross open ground, fully exposed to the gunmen below. "I'll create a distraction," Caleb decided, his mind racing through options and discarding most as too risky. "When they focus on me, you make a run for the horse." Elizabeth shook her head vehemently. "No, that's suicide." Caleb's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile under different circumstances. "I've survived worse odds." It was a lie. He had never faced such a desperate situation with someone else's life in his hands, but it seemed to reassure Elizabeth slightly. She gripped his arm, her fingers digging into the worn leather of his coat. "There must be another way," she insisted. Caleb gently removed her hand. "Get those documents to Tucson," he said firmly. "That's what matters now." Before Elizabeth could protest further, Caleb moved away from the boulder, staying low and using the scattered rocks and sparse vegetation for cover as he worked his way toward a position that would draw attention away from Elizabeth's path to the horse. He settled behind an outcropping that offered a clear view of the trail where Harker and one of his men were climbing toward them. Taking careful aim, Caleb fired a shot that struck the rock wall inches from Harker's head, sending the sheriff diving for cover. The response was immediate, a barrage of gunfire directed at Caleb's position, exactly as he had hoped. He risked a glance toward Elizabeth and saw her darting from cover to cover, making her way toward the horses. Another exchange of gunfire kept Harker's men occupied, allowing her to reach the juniper copse undetected. Caleb was down to his last 2 bullets when he heard the thunder of hoofbeats. Elizabeth had reached the horse and was riding hard, not away from the conflict as he had instructed, but directly toward his position. Harker and his companion had realized what was happening and were firing wildly at the approaching rider. With practiced precision, Caleb used his last shots to force them back into cover, buying precious seconds as Elizabeth urged the stallion up the rocky slope toward him. The horse reached his position, Elizabeth leaning down with an outstretched hand. "Come on!" she shouted over the gunfire. Without hesitation, Caleb grabbed her arm and swung up behind her, his empty revolver now useless except as a bluff. Elizabeth kicked the horse into motion, guiding it along the ridge and away from their pursuers. The stallion thundered across the high desert terrain, its powerful strides eating up the distance as Harker and his men scrambled to reach their own horses. "That was foolish," Caleb shouted over the wind, his arms around Elizabeth's waist as they rode. "You should have gone for help." Elizabeth glanced back at him, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "I wasn't about to leave you behind," she replied simply. Something shifted in Caleb's chest at her words, a warmth he had not felt in years spreading through him, despite the danger still hot on their heels. They rode hard through the morning, using every trick Caleb knew to obscure their trail, crossing streams, doubling back, riding over rocky ground that would hold no tracks. By midday, They had put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers, but Caleb knew better than to relax his vigilance. Harker would not give up easily, not with evidence that could send him to the gallows at stake. They stopped to rest the horse in a small box canyon that offered both water from a spring and a defensible position with clear lines of sight in all directions. Elizabeth dismounted stiffly, her legs unaccustomed to such hard riding. She withdrew the documents from her bodice, carefully unfolding them to ensure they had survived the journey intact. "These papers are worth dying for," she said softly, tracing the signatures at the bottom of one of the letters. "They prove that Harker and Whitmore have been murdering innocent people for profit." Caleb nodded grimly as he scanned the canyon rim for signs of pursuit. "Men have died for less." Elizabeth looked up at him, her expression troubled. "Why are you helping me? You said yourself that you kill for no one." The question caught Caleb off guard, forcing him to consider his own motivations, something he had deliberately avoided doing since agreeing to deliver Marcus's letter days ago. "Your brother saved my life once," Caleb admitted after a long moment of silence. "In a mining camp in Colorado. I was caught cheating at cards, falsely accused," he added with a hint of his old defiance, "and the mob was ready to string me up. Marcus stepped in, talked them down." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the memory. "I owed him." Elizabeth studied him, her gaze penetrating in a way that made Caleb want to turn away. "Is that the only reason?" she asked quietly. The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to address. Caleb busied himself checking his empty revolver, avoiding her eyes. "We should keep moving," he said, changing the subject. "Tucson is still 2 days' ride, and Harker knows these hills better than we do." Elizabeth allowed the evasion, her lips curving in a small smile that suggested she had received an answer despite his silence. They rode through the afternoon, keeping to high ground where possible to spot pursuit, and by evening had reached a small settlement called Cooper's Crossing. Little more than a trading post, a livery stable, and a handful of crude cabins clustered around a well. "We need ammunition," Caleb said, as they observed the settlement from a ridge overlooking it. "And supplies, if we're going to reach Tucson." Elizabeth nodded in agreement, her face showing the strain of the day's hard riding and constant tension. "Do you think it's safe?" she asked, eyeing the cluster of buildings warily. Caleb considered their options. Cooper's Crossing was off the main trails, and news traveled slowly to such isolated outposts. It was unlikely that word of the confrontation in Redemption Creek had reached here yet. "As safe as anywhere," he decided. "We'll stay only as long as necessary." He helped Elizabeth adjust her appearance as best they could, using water from their canteen to wash the dust from her face, and helping her to pin up her hair that had come loose during their flight. The trading post was dimly lit and smelled of leather, tobacco, and the various goods that lined its crowded shelves. The proprietor, a grizzled man with one cloudy eye and a perpetual scowl, watched them suspiciously as they entered. Caleb approached the counter, while Elizabeth browsed the shelves, selecting items they would need for the journey ahead. "Ammunition for a Colt .45, Caleb requested, placing coins on the counter. The proprietor's good eye narrowed as he studied Caleb's face. "Ain't seen you round these parts before," he commented, making no move to fill the order. Caleb met his gaze steadily. "Just passing through, heading to Tucson on business." The man grunted, seemingly satisfied with the explanation, and turned to retrieve a box of bullets from behind the counter. "Folks been talking about trouble up north," he remarked casually. "Some schoolteacher and an outlaw causing a ruckus in Redemption Creek." Caleb's hand moved imperceptibly closer to his empty gun, his expression betraying nothing, as Elizabeth froze in her browsing nearby. "That so?" he responded, his tone neutral. "Heard Sheriff Harker's got a posse after him. the proprietor continued, placing the ammunition on the counter. Offering a substantial reward too, dead or alive. He looked pointedly at Caleb, then at Elizabeth, his meaning clear. He recognized them but was willing to be bought. Caleb placed additional coins on the counter. "We'll need food for 2 days as well," he said evenly, "and information about who else might have come through here, asking questions." The proprietor's scowl softened slightly as he pocketed the money. "Ain't seen nobody official," he admitted, "but a rider came through about an hour ago, asking about a man and woman, matching your description. Paid for a fresh horse and rode south toward Tucson." The news was troubling. Harker had split his forces, sending someone ahead to cut them off, while he and the others continued the pursuit. "Is there another route to Tucson?" Elizabeth asked, joining Caleb at the counter with an armful of supplies. The proprietor scratched his stubbled chin thoughtfully. "There's an old Apache trail through the eastern foothills. Adds half a day to the journey, but it ain't used much these days. Too rough for most folks' liking." He retrieved a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil, sketching a crude map. "Follow the creek south for 5 miles. Then look for 3 standing rocks, like fingers, pointing at the sky. Trail starts there, winds through the hills before joining the main road about 15 miles north of Tucson." Caleb studied the map, committing it to memory before folding it and tucking it into his pocket. "Obliged," he said with a nod of thanks. They left Cooper's Crossing as dusk was falling, following the creek south as instructed. Neither spoke for some time, both lost in thought as the reality of their situation settled over them. "They won't stop coming after us, will they?" Elizabeth finally asked, her voice small in the gathering darkness. Caleb considered lying, offering reassurance he didn't feel, but something about this woman demanded honesty. "No," he answered truthfully. "Not until they have those documents." Elizabeth sighed, her shoulders slumping with fatigue. "I never imagined teaching school would lead to this," she said with a wry twist to her lips. "When I came west, the worst I expected was homesickness and perhaps some resistance to education from the local families." Despite everything, Caleb found himself smiling at her understated humor. "And I never expected to be riding for my life with a schoolteacher," he responded. "Life has a way of surprising us." They found the 3 rock formations just as night fully descended, making further travel treacherous in the unfamiliar terrain. Caleb located a defensible position among the rocks, a natural alcove that offered shelter and concealment. They made a cold camp, unable to risk a fire that might betray their position to pursuers. Elizabeth huddled in her thin coat, shivering in the desert night that had turned surprisingly cold. Without comment, Caleb removed his own coat and draped it around her shoulders. "You need it more than I do," he said when she protested. "I've spent plenty of nights under the stars." They shared a meager meal of jerky and hardtack purchased at the trading post, washing it down with water from the creek. The silence between them was comfortable now, the shared danger creating a bond neither had anticipated when they first met in the saloon that seemed a lifetime ago. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Blackwood," Elizabeth said as they sat side by side, looking up at the star-filled sky. "How does a man become an outlaw?" The question held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. Caleb was silent for so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer, but finally he spoke. "I was a Union soldier," he began, his voice low and rough with memories. "Fought at Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg. Saw things no man should see." He paused, images from those bloody battlefields flickering behind his eyes. "When the war ended, I tried to go home to Pennsylvania, but there was nothing left for me there. My family was gone, The farm sold for taxes. So I drifted west, did whatever work I could find. Cattle drives, mining, scouting for the army. His laugh was hollow. Turned out I had a talent for violence and not much patience for being told what to do. Elizabeth listened without interruption, her face illuminated by moonlight as she absorbed his story. The first time I broke the law was in '68, Caleb continued, surprising himself with his candor. A mining company in Nevada was cheating its workers, withholding pay, forcing them to buy supplies at company prices. Some men I'd worked with asked me to help them take what they were owed. He shrugged, as if the decision had been inconsequential rather than the turning point of his life. After that, it got easier to justify each job. Banks were insured, stagecoaches carried rich men's money, and I was good at what I did. Never killed unless I had to, he added. Though whether the clarification was for her benefit or his own, he couldn't say. Elizabeth's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. "And now?" she asked softly. "What do you want now?" The question struck Caleb with unexpected force. What did he want? For years, his only desire had been survival. The next job, the next town, always moving, never putting down roots or forming attachments that could be used against him. "Peace, maybe," he answered finally, the admission surprising him as much as it seemed to surprise Elizabeth. "A place where no one knows my name or what I've done." He withdrew his hand from hers, uncomfortable with the vulnerability he was showing. "What about you, schoolteacher? What made you leave Boston for a dusty frontier town?" Elizabeth smiled, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Books," she replied simply. "I wanted to bring books to children who had never held one, to show them worlds beyond these mountains and deserts." Her expression grew distant. "My parents died when I was young. Books were my escape, my comfort. I wanted to offer that same gift to others." Morning brought renewed determination and a sense of urgency. They set out on the Apache Trail, a narrow path that wound through rugged terrain, climbing steep hillsides and descending into hidden valleys. The going was slow, the trail often barely discernible among the rocks and scrub brush, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that Harker's men were still in pursuit and that another rider was potentially waiting for them on the main road to Tucson. By midday, they had covered perhaps 10 miles, the sun beating down mercilessly as they picked their way through a particularly difficult stretch of trail that skirted a deep ravine. "Someone's following us," Caleb said suddenly, reining in the horse. Elizabeth turned in the saddle, scanning the path behind them. "I don't see anyone," she said, squinting against the glare. Caleb pointed to a distant ridge they had crossed an hour earlier. "Dust," he explained, moving too deliberately to be an animal. They pushed on with renewed urgency, the horse laboring under their combined weight on the steep trail. By late afternoon, they had reached a plateau that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape. In the distance, perhaps 15 miles away, they could see the faint outline of buildings, the outskirts of Tucson. "We're close," Elizabeth said, hope evident in her voice. "If we push hard, we could reach town by nightfall." Caleb studied the terrain ahead, his experienced eye noting the challenges that still lay between them and safety. "The trail descends through that canyon," he said, pointing to a narrow cut in the plateau's edge. "It's the only way down from here, and a perfect place for an ambush." Elizabeth's expression fell as she realized the implications. "You think they're waiting for us?" Caleb nodded grimly. "I would be, if I were them." The decision was made to approach the canyon cautiously, leaving the horse tethered in a sheltered spot while they scouted ahead on foot. They moved silently, Caleb leading the way with his now loaded Colt held ready. The canyon was eerily quiet, the only sound their own careful footsteps and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. They had nearly reached the entrance when Caleb raised a hand, signaling Elizabeth to stop. He pointed to a subtle disruption in the pattern of stones along the canyon wall. The edge of a boot print, partially obscured but recognizable to his trained eye. "Someone's been here recently," he whispered. "Recently enough that the wind hasn't completely erased their tracks." Elizabeth's hand moved unconsciously to her bodice, where the documents were still hidden. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Caleb surveyed their surroundings, considering options and finding few that didn't end with one or both of them dead. The canyon was the only practical route down from the plateau. Attempting to descend elsewhere would mean navigating sheer cliffs or taking a detour of many miles that would certainly allow their pursuers to catch up. "We need a distraction," he decided finally. "Something to draw them out or force them to show their positions." Elizabeth looked around, her gaze settling on a cluster of loose rocks near the canyon edge. "Would a rock slide work?" she suggested. Caleb followed her gaze and nodded slowly, a plan forming in his mind. "It might," he agreed. "If we can trigger one from a safe distance, it could flush out anyone waiting in ambush." They worked quickly, gathering more rocks to add to the naturally unstable formation, creating a precarious balance that would collapse with minimal disturbance. From a position of relative safety, Caleb took careful aim and fired a single shot at the key supporting stone in their improvised trap. The effect was immediate and more dramatic than they had anticipated. A cascade of rocks tumbled into the canyon with a thunderous roar, raising a cloud of dust that temporarily obscured their view. When the dust began to settle, they heard what they had hoped for: shouts of alarm and the sound of running feet as whoever had been hiding in the canyon abandoned their positions to avoid the falling rocks. Two figures emerged, coughing and covered in dust. One was Reynolds, Whitmore's hired gun, and the other a man Caleb didn't recognize. Both were armed and quickly sought cover as they realized what had happened. "That's only two," Caleb muttered, scanning the canyon. "There should be at least one more." His suspicion was confirmed when a shot rang out from higher up the canyon wall, the bullet striking the rock near Caleb's head. "There," Elizabeth said, pointing to a ledge about 50 feet above the canyon floor where a rifleman had set up a sniper's position. Caleb fired twice in rapid succession, forcing the shooter to duck behind a boulder. "We need to move now," he urged, grabbing Elizabeth's hand. "The rock slide has given us a chance." They're disorganized and separated. They ran back to where they had left the horse, mounted quickly, and spurred the animal toward the canyon, now committed to their desperate gambit. The stallion thundered into the canyon, its hooves raising fresh dust that provided additional cover as they rode. Shots echoed off the canyon walls, most going wide in the confusion. But one grazed Caleb's arm, tearing his shirt and drawing blood. Elizabeth felt him flinch and glanced back in alarm. "You're hit!" Caleb grimaced, but kept riding. "It's nothing," he assured her, though the burning pain suggested otherwise. "Keep going." They emerged from the canyon into a broad valley, the trail now clear and well-defined as it descended toward Tucson. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of pursuit resuming, but they had gained precious minutes and an open stretch of terrain where their horses' speed gave them an advantage over men navigating the rocky debris of the rockslide. They rode hard through the afternoon, the distance to Tucson steadily diminishing as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Caleb's arm throbbed, the sleeve of his shirt now soaked with blood, but he refused to stop even when Elizabeth suggested binding the wound, As twilight gathered, the buildings of Tucson grew more distinct. Adobe structures and wooden false fronts silhouetted against the darkening sky. "We're going to make it," Elizabeth said, her voice breathless with hope. Caleb, however, remained tense and vigilant, all too aware that they were still vulnerable until they reached the U.S. Marshal's office and placed the incriminating documents in official hands. His caution was justified when a rifle shot cracked the twilight stillness, the bullet passing between them close enough that both felt its displacement of air. "Ambush!" Caleb shouted, urging the already exhausted horse to a final burst of speed as more shots followed the first. The rider from Cooper's Crossing had indeed reached Tucson ahead of them and set up a position along their approach. Caleb returned fire as they rode, his shots less precise than usual due to the jolting gait of the horse and the pain in his wounded arm. One bullet found its mark, however, as their attacker cried out and fell from his concealed position among the rocks beside the trail. They thundered past without slowing, now within sight of Tucson's main street and the safety it promised. The sun had set completely by the time they reached the town, their horse lathered and breathing heavily as they navigated the streets toward the center of town, where the law offices would be located. Citizens stepped hastily aside as they passed, alarmed by their appearance, dust-covered, blood-stained, and clearly fleeing something terrible. They reined in before a solid brick building with U.S. Marshal painted on its window, both nearly falling from the saddle in their exhaustion. The Marshal's office was brightly lit, a stark contrast to the gathering darkness outside. Marshal Thomas Byrne was a tall, lean man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the Arizona sun. He looked up from his desk with a startled expression as Caleb and Elizabeth burst through the door, both disheveled and Caleb's left sleeve saturated with blood. "What in tarnation?" the marshal exclaimed, rising to his feet with one hand moving instinctively to the revolver on his hip. Elizabeth stepped forward, her legs unsteady after the long ride, but her voice clear and determined. "Marshal Byrne, my name is Elizabeth Morgan. I have evidence of criminal conspiracy, murder, and land fraud involving Sheriff James Harker of Redemption Creek and Cornelius Whitmore of the Western Arizona Railroad." She reached into her bodice and withdrew the packet of documents, now crumpled and stained but intact, and placed them on the marshal's desk. Byrne looked from the documents to Elizabeth, then to Caleb, who remained near the door, one hand pressed against his wounded arm, while the other still held his Colt, ready for any pursuit that might burst in behind them. "That there is Caleb Blackwood," a deputy remarked from the corner of the office, recognition dawning on his young face. "He's wanted in 3 territories." Byrne's gaze sharpened as he studied Caleb more closely. "That so?" he asked, his tone neutral. Elizabeth moved to stand between Caleb and the lawmen. "This man saved my life," she stated firmly. "Multiple times. Without him, this evidence would never have reached you." She gestured to the documents on the desk. "Sheriff Harker and his men are pursuing us right now. They've already tried to kill us both to prevent these papers from reaching you." Byrne picked up the packet, breaking the seal and beginning to examine the contents. His expression grew increasingly grave as he read, occasionally glancing up at Elizabeth for confirmation of some particularly shocking detail. "These are serious accusations, ma'am," he said finally, his voice somber, especially against a fellow lawman. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "They are true, Marshal, every word. My brother discovered their scheme and paid with his life. I nearly paid with mine as well." She gestured toward Caleb, "As did Mr. Blackwood, who had no stake in this matter, but chose to help me nonetheless." Byrne considered this, then turned to his deputy. "Fetch the doctor for Mr. Blackwood's arm. Then gather the men. I want a perimeter around the town. Nobody enters without being questioned. Understood?" The deputy nodded and hurried out to carry out his orders. Burns' attention returned to Caleb, his expression unreadable. "As for you, Mr. Blackwood, there's the matter of those warrants." Elizabeth began to protest, but Caleb silenced her with a gentle touch on her arm. "It's all right," he said softly, before addressing the marshal. "I won't deny I've broken the law, Marshal. I've robbed stages and banks, though I've never killed a man who wasn't trying to kill me first." He carefully placed his revolver on a nearby table, a gesture of surrender. "I helped Miss Morgan because it was the right thing to do, not for any pardon or leniency." Burns studied Caleb thoughtfully, then glanced again at the documents Elizabeth had delivered. "Sit down before you fall down," he said gruffly. "We'll discuss your situation after the doctor's seen to that arm." The next hours passed in a blur of activity as Byrne organized his deputies, sent telegrams to territorial authorities, and questioned Elizabeth in detail about the events in Redemption Creek and the journey to Tucson. Caleb's wound was cleaned and bandaged by the town doctor, who pronounced it a nasty furrow, but not life-threatening, so long as infection didn't set in. Through it all, Caleb sat quietly, conserving his strength and observing the proceedings with the detachment of a man who had accepted whatever fate awaited him. By midnight, word arrived that Harker and his remaining men had been spotted approaching Tucson from the north. Byrne and his deputies met them at the edge of town, and after a brief but intense standoff, Harker surrendered, his nerve failing when confronted with the knowledge that his crimes had been exposed and his powerful partner Whitmore would be unable to protect him. Dawn found Caleb sitting on a bench outside the marshal's office, watching the sun rise over the adobe buildings of Tucson. His arm was properly bandaged now, resting in a sling fashioned by the doctor. The door opened, and Elizabeth emerged, looking tired but relieved after her night of providing statements and identifying documents for the marshal. She sat beside Caleb, close enough that their shoulders touched. "It's over," she said simply. "Marshal Byrne has set men to arrest Whitmore in Phoenix. Harker is in a cell, along with Reynolds and the others." Caleb nodded, unsurprised by the news, but pleased nonetheless. "And the mine?" he asked. Elizabeth smiled faintly. "Legally mine now, according to the marshal. Though I have no interest in becoming a mine owner. I think I'll sell it and use the money to rebuild the school in Redemption Creek, or perhaps start a new one elsewhere." The silence that followed was companionable, but tinged with the knowledge that their paths would soon diverge. Elizabeth to return to her teaching, Caleb to face the consequences of his past. "Marshal Byrne wants to speak with you," Elizabeth said finally, her hand finding his as it had that night under the stars. "He says," she hesitated, hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. "He says there might be an arrangement. Even your help in bringing down Harker and Whitmore, something called a conditional pardon." Caleb looked at her in surprise. Conditional pardons were rare, typically reserved for minor offenses rather than the serious crimes that made up his record. "What kind of conditions?" he asked cautiously. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "You'd have to stay in one place for 2 years. Report regularly to a law enforcement officer. No weapons." She took a deep breath before continuing. "Redemption Creek will need a new sheriff once things settle down." The irony of the suggestion that he, an outlaw, might become the very thing he had spent years avoiding and outwitting was not lost on Caleb. Yet as he considered the possibility, he found it strangely appealing. A chance to use his skills and knowledge for something other than survival or profit, but chance to stay in one place, to perhaps put down those roots he had admitted to wanting under the desert stars. A chance to remain near the schoolteacher who had somehow breached the walls he had built around himself over years of solitary existence. "I'm no lawman," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Elizabeth smiled, seeing through his token protest. "You have a stronger sense of justice than most who wear a badge," she countered. "You risked your life to help me bring evidence against corrupt men when you could have simply ridden away." Caleb looked down at their joined hands, then up at the woman who had shown more courage and determination than many hardened men he had known. "I told you I don't kill for anyone," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "But for you, I might be willing to live for something." Elizabeth's smile widened, reaching her eyes and illuminating her face with a beauty that transcended her dusty, travel-worn appearance. "Then I suggest you go speak with the marshal," she said, releasing his hand and gently nudging him toward the office door. Caleb stood, wincing slightly as the movement jarred his wounded arm. He paused, looking back at Elizabeth with an intensity that communicated what he wasn't yet ready to put into words. Then, squaring his shoulders, Caleb Blackwood, outlaw, gunfighter, and reluctant hero, opened the door and stepped toward a future he had never imagined possible. The law office's door swung closed behind him, leaving Elizabeth Morgan alone on the bench in the early morning light. She looked out at the awakening town, her mind already turning to the school she would build and the children she would teach. And perhaps, if a certain former outlaw decided to accept a badge, she might also have a steadfast ally with whom to share the challenges and rewards of life on the American frontier. The schoolteacher had whispered, "Save me," and in doing so had inadvertently saved them both.